Welcome back. We want to take a quick look at how the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century and then its recurrent appearance and devastation really quite regularly into the 15th and 16th century seems to have affected the productions of art and culture. And really the overwhelming observation is that becomes a overwhelming interest in thinking about and representing what we'll call the macabre, both death and the idea of the fleetingness of the world, of the inevitability and the indiscriminacy of death as the great leveler that comes at any time and that flattens human experience. I want to begin in the city of Siena, the lovely Tuscan town. This is an image of the still medieval town in the central area. Siena in 1348 was absolutely devastated by the Black Death. It may have lost up to 70 or 80% of its population. What we're seeing here is the Palazzo Pubblico, the public palace, the town hall, which was the center of government. Here it is again. Still a wonderful place to visit. In the central area, in the central room, a wonderful artist named Ambrogio Lorenzetti painted a series of frescoes in the Sala di Nove, which was the council the room where the Council of Nine, the ruling elite of the city, met and governed. And in it, on two facing walls, is a picture of good government, which you show here, which shows a prosperous, economically active and happy city in full fling, and these dancers are absolutely famous. In comparison to bad government, which is on the opposite wall. These date to about 1340, so about the decade of the Black Death. And the reason I start with this is because this is the countryside. I've always thought of this as the metaphor for the Black Death. Ambrogio Lorenzetti himself died in the plague, along with so many other artists of the period, of course. And it seems to me that we've gone from, and that 1347, 1348 marks the transition from the city, the happy city that is being, you see there's construction going on up here, and you've got teaching and classrooms going on down here, and trade, and of course dancing and delightfulness, passing to death, to slavery, and to the rule of tyranny. And here this is both the tyrant but also death himself, and that is the countryside devastated. Siena itself was particularly hit. It was one of these prosperous city-states in the later Middle Ages, and they had this wonderful cathedral. You have to imagine away the west facade. I always think of it as the zebra cathedral because it's striped inside out, done in the course of the 13th and early 14th century. But because Siena was growing so much, there was a decision in the beginning of the 14th century, to make a huge cathedral that would compete with the Cathedral of Florence. And the idea, let me get my pen, the idea was to take the central church, the existent church, and make it into the nave, such that they were going to build make it into the transept, such that they were going to build a new nave, right? Here, make this the transept, put the altar here, and be able to accommodate a much bigger city. And much bigger, the congregation, much bigger services. It was going to be a monumental building showing the importance of Siena as in the realm, in the northern Italian civic life. And indeed, they began building it. And what you see here is the unfinished nave. This would have been the new west wall. It wouldn't have been west, but the new entrance, which would have had a wonderful rose window. And it was abandoned when plague hit. This is another, it seems to me, metaphor for the stilting, the stopping, the halting of the kind of economic prosperity and advanced population increase that had been heralded mostly in the 13th century. 1951, a very important art historian named Millard Meese published this very influential book called Painting in Florence and Siena After the Black Death, where he put forward the argument that the fact of the Black Death changed the aesthetics of art quite fundamentally. That an artistic sensibility, that the Black Death gave way to a new heightened spirituality, and that the trend the trend in the early 14th century towards greater naturalism that would ultimately herald Renaissance painting was stilted in a sudden concern for the otherworldly, the abstracted, and then essentially the transcendental. The thesis has not been universally accepted. But it has been a touch point for thinking about the development of the arts in the wake of the Black Death. What we can say is that we see a series of very specific changes. One is we're going to spend a moment on the plague cults, and then look at the increasing interest in death, primarily in Northern Europe. So Millard Meese was talking largely about a Southern aesthetic, and the cult of death that we see is really in evidence in the 15th and 16th centuries in Germany and England and France, more so than in Italy. Right, so the plague cults. In medieval European Christianity, one of the important features of devotion was the cult of the saints, the worship of saints as people, exemplary humans who were in heaven with God and could intercede with God. And in the later period, it was really the Virgin Mary who became the most important. But there were whole numbers of saints, and two in particular seem to have responded and become particular intercessors for plague victims. The first is Saint Sebastian, who's actually had been around for a long time. He was a 3rd century saint who was persecuted under Diocletian. The thing to know about him, though, is that when he was first discovered to be a Christian, Diocletian ordered that he be sort of executed by firing squad, but by a firing squad of arrows. And the story goes that he was he was executed. Well, I mean, he was shot through with arrows such that, I like this, he represented an urchin, right, like a porcupine, right, with spindly needles sticking out of him. But he didn't die, and a pious Christian nursed him back to health. When Diocletian discovered that he wasn't dead, he had him executed again, and this time he was cudgeled to death. But you'll remember the metaphor of the arrows, right, as being the arrow of death, of plague striking like an arrow or a dart that you see throughout the literature. This is, again, I evoke Gabriel de Mussis, who used this metaphor a number of times. And Sebastian really did become, because he had survived the dart of the plague, he did become an exemplar. Here's a 15th century painting, and let's go up here, if you see up here, you see Saint Sebastian shot through with arrows, interceding with Christ for plague victims. This is a plague victim who is dead, and this is a funeral mass, he's being buried, and of course this is to intercede with him that he might be admitted to heaven, right, interceding for him for his salvation, not for his cure, but that would have also happened. The second saint that seems to have developed a particular following as a plague saint is Saint Roch. Saint Roch was he lived in the 14th century, and he actually contracted plague and recovered from it. He is not a martyr. He died in a prison, actually, but he wasn't killed by it. But the story says that he was on pilgrimage to Rome, where he cared for the ill and cared for the ill and dying, and ultimately contracted the disease. And what's interesting about this wonderful statue, which is in the Cloisters collection in New York, is that you can see here the characteristic bubo of the Black Death. He contracted it, he went into the forest to recover, and he was aided, nursed to health by his dog. Here you have the dog who here is eating a bagel, or bringing him a bagel, or so it seems to me. The most obvious thing to note in looking at the artistic record of the later medieval period, of the period after the Black Death, particularly in the 15th and 16th century, is the immense concentration, the immense interest in death. And this is generally grouped under the memento mori genre of art that is reminding people of death, and that life is transient, the time is short, and you can go at any point. Here you have a little skeleton reminding a youth that he will soon die. One of the repeated themes in this is that death is the great leveler, that wealthy and poor alike, powerful and menial, all will end up in the same place. This is an interesting image from a 15th century moral treatise that shows death in the form of a skeleton beating down the powerful, whose power will govern their future not as they die. A popular theme is of the danse macabre. The danse macabre actually seems to have grown out, the theme seems to have actually grown out of a performance practice that seems to have emerged actually right in the wake of the Black Death, a kind of frenzied public reaction of people dancing and with death interspersed with them and then falling down on the ground. We have evidence of it from 1350 in Paris. And there was poetry written around the theme of the danse macabre. And then in the 15th and 16th century, we have a lot of visual evidence of the theme. This is from that woodcut from 1463. I believe it's the same chronicle as the image of the burning of the Jews that I showed you during that portion. Here's a wonderful, I actually have two slices from it, from a fresco in Slovenia from the very late 15th century. And you can see we've got both bishops and cardinals and priests, along with laborers, but also wealthy men here, participating in the dance, or here's the procession of death. The earliest image we know of in Northern Europe seems to be in the cemetery of Les Innocents, the Innocent Cemetery in Paris from 1425. Death comes to all regardless of their position in the social hierarchy and makes no distinction. Another version of this theme is the transitum. Transitum, here, right, let me get you this one. The transitum developed again in the late 15th century. This is the tomb of Henry Cecele, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in Canterbury, and it is the theme of the intact body in its prime at the top, along with the rotting, decaying corpse that we see at underneath. And I'm going to show you another example. This is actually the earliest one we know of, and it's a slightly different genre. This is a tomb of a nobleman who died in the plague. He died in 1363, and you can see his eyes up here, and his groin are being eaten out by toads, and over here you can see the worms. And this, again, suggests some anxiety about death and the passing state of human existence. The interest here in rotting and corruption and decay of the body were all themes that were associated with plague. This might just simply be because it was more evident they couldn't get people buried quickly enough, and so the physical process of decomposition was just more clear to people because they weren't able to sequester them away into burial rapidly enough. Another theme we see with some frequency is this theme of the three living meeting the three dead. The story here is that three rich young men in the prime of life, here you have them from a 14th century French illuminated manuscript, are walking through the woods, enjoying life and finery and position, and they come upon three dead men here who used to be rich, who used to be young. They're often shown in different states of decomposition, one as like a fresh cadaver and one like with maggots crawling over it, one a pure skeleton. And the story goes that, the dead tell the story of their lives and say that they had all the privileges, but it came to naught, and now they are but skeletons. Famous line is, "We were once what you are, and what we are now you will be." So this is just a memorial of the passing of earthly joys and wealth. Here are just three more examples, again, all from the later medieval period of the three wealthy. Here you have kings and bishops in the example on the right. This always has to be understood within a religious framework of ultimate salvation and bodily resurrection, which complicates the issue of decay and transience. But if you want to take the religious frame, you might consider the increasing interest in the Passion of Christ. There's always been a huge interest in the Passion of Christ. The imagery becomes actually really quite graphic. I would call it gory, that you're seeing in the 15th, 16th century. This is a famous painting by Albert Bouts from the middle of I guess it must be the mid-15th century. I'll have to check that. With the graphic detail of his bodily suffering and the bodily infirmity that comes upon incarnation. And I'll leave you with perhaps the most famous example of the genre, which is Peter Bruegel's Triumph of Death. This is, 1560, so we're a good 2 centuries after the onset of the Black Death. But you do need to remember the continual, repeated devastation of plague that marched through the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. And it's an amazing patriot. Look at the entry in Wikipedia is actually very good. I encourage you to go read it. This is an army of death. You have it here marching in and indiscriminately pushing everybody into this kind of, I don't know, I guess it's a tomb or a coffin or something. You got these armies of skeletons coming, and the death and misery that you see throughout the wasted land of misery is, here I have a detail. The detail here just emphasizes the extent of the preoccupation with death and indiscriminate devastation at the hands of death of humanity and the landscape and civilization. And on that cheery note, till next time, which will be the last installment.